All right. Well, welcome everybody to the Get Housing Right conference presented by the University of Rhode Island Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies with support from Homes RI. I'm Aaron Lay. I'm from the University of Rhode Island. I'm the director of URI's Master of Public Administration program. Today's panel, Transformative Affordable Housing Policies, covers lessons learned from France's social housing programs, ideas for a potential federal social housing development authority, and the local outcomes of state affordable housing appeal systems. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists, I want to cover a few points of order. Our panelists will present for approximately 15 minutes each. We are going to hold questions until all presentations have concluded. We have scheduled about 25 minutes for a Q&A session, which should leave us plenty of time to have a great conversation. I encourage everybody in the audience to enter your thoughts and questions into the chat. You can do this while our panelists are presenting or wait until the Q&A session starts. I promise to keep an eye on the chat throughout this event, and I'll be jotting down some questions as we're having our presenters presenting. Now I'm happy to introduce our first panelist. I'm going to go through all four of them though. Our first panelist will be Jacob Carlson from Brown University. So welcome, Jacob, to our panel. Our second panelist is Magda Maaoui. She's from the University of Cergy-Paris. So thanks for coming all the way from Paris, Magda. Nick Marantz and Zheng are going to be presenting some of their research from the University of California, Irvine. So welcome, Nick and Echo, and thank you for being here. So I'm going to suggest the following presentation order: Jacob, Magda, Nick, and Echo. So without any further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it off to Jacob so that he can tell us a little bit about the work that he's doing.
Okay, great. Can you see the slides? All right. Thanks so much, Aaron. And thanks, Jen, Kate, and the Housing RI and the University of Rhode Island team. It's very, very exciting to be here. And I'm excited to be calling in from Providence to talk with you all as we grapple with all these issues we're dealing with in housing. Because we probably know that something is really wrong with housing right now. In 2021, homes increased at a greater value than the average wage of a worker. You could make more money just sitting in your home than you can make from your wages at work. And we know that during the pandemic, rents that had previously seen a temporary dip were shooting back to higher than they had ever been before. So that now that we've got approximately 30%, almost half of renters spend more than a third of their income on rent, and even a quarter spend more than half of their income giving over to their landlords. But we've known for a long time that this housing system also actually rewards racism. Whether it's the history of redlining, exclusionary communities, what Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has called predatory inclusion, all these different instances of racism in appraisals, you can make a lot of money with racism in housing. So the system is designed in particular ways. Now, part of it is that housing has always been kind of a complicated thing. On the one hand, it's this essential human need. We have a need for shelter. But also, especially in the US context, it's an economic asset and a particularly lucrative one. And now it's this latter function that I think we've increasingly seen push aside the needs of the former. We can see now that when we think about housing policy, it's much more conceivable to think that you can see this in housing policy. We would prefer to set policy that constrains people's access to shelter rather than constrain their ability to make profit from housing. And so the result is that our affordable housing policy is mostly about essentially sort of bribing the private sector to create things that we really need as a society. Now, today I want to talk about a framework for thinking about possible solutions to this housing crisis, what we might call social housing. Now, in the US, we don't have a really clear idea what that is. Magda doesn't need this. Europe has something called social housing that has a long, long history. In the US, it's really only come into the parlance in the past few years, I'd say, and there's a lot of debates about what exactly it means. So we want to sort of provisionally put forward a framework for thinking about this. And at the end of the day, I wanted you to take away three things. One is about what we think social housing is in the US context. Two, that it's really not crazy, that it's very much within the bounds of things we've already done in housing policy with some tweaks, but that it's going to take work. It's going to take political will and imagination to transition ourselves to a robust system of social housing that we would like in the US. I want to back up and acknowledge that a lot of this work is done with a team of folks at the Urban Democracy Lab, particularly Gianpaolo Baiocchi. And that also all this work is not in a bubble. These aren't things that we're inventing on their own. A lot of folks have been working on this, whether it's the Homes Guarantee, Right to the City Alliance, Community Service Society, People's Policy Project, Center for Popular Democracy. This is a budding and growing sort of set of discussions that we hope we can productively contribute to. Now, what do we mean by social housing, and particularly what we're going to talk about today, social housing 2.0? We want it to have three qualities. One is that it's non-speculative, meaning that the cost and access to your housing is not solely determined by the private market, that there are some sort of intermediaries that determine access and cost. Two is that it has some degree of democratic control, that residents have a meaningful say over their own living conditions, that they're not sort of at the whims of faceless bureaucracies or faceless landlords. And lastly, that it needs to be publicly backed. The government needs to have some sort of stake in housing to ensure that it is essentially too important to fail. Now, we call this social housing because it upholds the value of housing as a right and a social good. But we use this moniker 2.0 because it exists in a longer lineage of social housing. What we sort of might call social housing 1.0, which is some of the large-scale government-run and government-created housing projects, particularly from the post-war eras, particularly in Europe, but also in the US. And some of these have really great successes, such as those in Austria and most of those in Europe. Some have more sort of checkered histories, such as some of the public housing in the US. That we can talk about the ways that it was sort of sabotaged from the early years, but this is an early iteration of public housing that was social housing that was created and sort of run by the government. Then we have what we sort of call social housing 1.5, which is instances where communities likely came together to create and provide housing on their own. In the US, many may be familiar with the community land trust examples or the limited equity cooperative examples, where you have cooperatively held either land or housing, and there are some restrictions on how much money you can make from a resale. We also draw a lot of sort of inspiration from some examples in the Global South that I'll talk about in just a moment. Now, the deal with social housing 1.0 is that it was definitely non-speculative and it was definitely publicly backed. The amount of democratic participation, a little bit less so, especially in the US. People were often at the whims of these faceless housing authorities and couldn't really influence the conditions in their communities. Conversely, social housing 1.0, we have a lot of democratic participation and it was non-speculative, but there's been very little public backing, meaning that the ability for this kind of housing to come to scale has been hugely hindered. And so I want to take a brief detour to one example, which is in Uruguay, a sort of housing collective called FUCVAM. Now, this is the one over in the bottom right. Started in around 66 with a lot of ties to the labor movement, but not much state support in the beginning. Today, there's about 600 cooperatives around Uruguay, housing about 2% of the population. And it's been a model that's been replicated throughout the Global South, particularly Latin America. And essentially the way it works is you have a cooperative that brings households together to acquire and develop housing. People are often involved in the direct construction of their own housing and the management of it. Today, the government has special funding that is explicitly for cooperatives. But the cooperators are essentially member users, but not owners per se, which means that when they come in to live in the house, they can receive some financing. They help pay back the cost of the housing, but when they want to sell, they don't sort of go out and sell on the open market. They sell it back to the co-op and get essentially back what they paid in. So it turns housing not as much into a a sort of speculative investment vehicle, but more like a savings bank. And the result is that you've got mixed income housing that stretches well into the middle class. You have teachers and doctors and construction workers all living there. Now, why do we bring up these examples from the global South? You know, right now there's a lot of interest, especially in the US, of sort of European style social housing. And we definitely think that large scale national social housing is something we should absolutely demand. It really makes everything easier and I would argue probably better to do. But, you know, a lot of these examples were built in the mid 1900s when national governments really worked together to solve these national crises. Unfortunately, I think if we're going to be waiting on a functioning national government to solve the housing crisis, we're probably going to be waiting a while. And so we think lessons from the global South, like FUCFAM, were originally created with little national housing assistance, where people just said, we're not going to wait, we're going to do this on our own. I think we should probably consider the US in a closer situation to the global South and Western Europe. And so that means we got to think about states and localities developing these kinds of social housing policies. But what that means is that it's likely going to be a lot of housing policies that are tailored to local specific conditions, and there's probably not going to be a one-size-fits-all template. So in this Social Housing 2.0 report, we sort of lay out a set of considerations one might think of. Now, a social housing agency, to create social housing, it needs to do certain things that are things that cities and states and governments already do. So what do you need? You need something that can acquire land and property. You need something that can handle construction and development. You need something that can manage property. You need something that can handle financing, provide money to create the housing. You need some sort of accountability, enforcement to make sure people are sort of following the rules and not reproducing exclusionary practices. And you probably are also going to need some capacity building for people to learn how to do housing in new ways. And really, these are not new things. Governments already do these things. So it's sort of a question of how do we package them in a new way. We have acquisition bodies like land banks. We have lots of construction capacity with road construction. People build housing or build construction projects for schools. We already have property management authorities through housing authorities. We have lots of financing possibilities through states and cities, through financing agencies and bonding authorities, all sorts of things like that. We do have code enforcement agencies to ensure accountability. And we have things like workforce training and other sorts of government training opportunities to teach people how to do things. So I say all this to, you know, when we start throwing out new terms like social housing, we think, oh, God, what the heck is this? This is to say that these aren't sort of often left field. These are things that we already do as governments. But there's sort of a question of how we do them, and that's going to be a lot tailored to local context. You could think of a social housing project as sort of being more universalist in the sense that it provides housing for everybody, or perhaps a more targeted social housing policy that's really providing housing to the lowest income people. You could have one, okay, thanks. You could have different levels of sort of community management versus government management. Community management would be more on the side of community land trusts, and government management and ownership would be more on the side of sort of US style public housing. It could be revenue independent, meaning that it's generating and recouping costs on its own, or it could be heavily subsidized. You could imagine one that's very centralized in a government, or very decentralized in a lot of sort of associated confederated community land trusts or living equity co-ops. And it could rely varyingly on public financing versus private financing. Public financing has less restrictions and sort of to what extent it's beholden to private interests, but on the other hand, it's harder to get sometimes and slower. So there are all these trade-offs that localities will need to be thinking about. And people are already starting to do this. Across the country, there are all sorts of bills and efforts to create something resembling social housing. I'd say we're sort of in the early stages of this and people are still figuring it out. Nothing's been passed yet, but people are working today to try to make these things a reality. I'll talk very briefly about one effort that we've been a part of, what we've called the Social Housing Development Authority. This started out as a federal proposal. We have some bill text, but I don't have to tell you about what national politics is like right now, but we've started to translate that into what it could look like for New York City. And essentially, as you'll see, it uses a lot of stuff that's already sort of on the table. Essentially what it is a body that could acquire, particularly the focus is on distressed housing assets that today often get gobbled up by private equity and investors, but to capture those and convert them into social housing. Usually with sorts of environmental and green rehabilitation efforts, but then convert it and transfer it over into a limited equity cooperative, a community land trust, or to a public housing authority. So it would essentially work as one body that could serve as a land bank, would be a bank that would provide financing to acquire and manage the thing. It would help as a sort of public works agency to do the rehab, but it's also combined with a lot of policies that are also gaining a lot of traction, such as tenant opportunity to purchase, where renters, when a landlord is about to sell, rather than selling it to another landlord, can opt to buy the housing themselves. We've had a lot of success with that around the country. It's growing. I won't bore you with this. This is sort of a flow chart that you could see in our report in more detail about what happens when a distressed housing asset goes up. How does it sort of fall through the waterfall of the process? At the end of the day, for us to think about how do we get to a different kind of housing system that we might think is more socially just, equitable, and beneficial for people, I think there's a few questions we need to ask. One is that, does it reduce the treatment of housing as a speculative asset? Does it help people learn and exercise democracy and inclusion in their communities? And does it move us on the path toward enshrining land and housing as a right and social good? I think one sort of risk is that in the coming years, I think as social housing becomes more of a buzzword, there's a risk of it sort of diluting its meaning. And so these are some important questions, I think, as we start to move towards something very different from what we have now, acknowledging that transition is hard and takes a lot of work. And so I think we sort of can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good in instances where we need to do a lot of work to move us past what we are sort of in today. And I think, is that it? That's my last slide.
All right.
Responding.
All right. Thank you, Jacob. That was right on point, right at 15 minutes. So that was excellent. And again, I want to go ahead and encourage the audience. If you have any insights or thoughts or anything like that, please put them in the chat. I'll jot them down, and then we'll kind of use that as a conversation to at the end of the Q&A session.